Good evening, dear friends. When I was reflecting on what should we talk about tonight, I was very aware of the current crises that are happening in our world. As you know, we have crises of relationship between peoples of the world. And it shows itself in a very destructive and very crude manner. People who go about making awful videos and movies about manifestations of God and religious leaders, of founders of sublime nature, and then followers of those religions who respond equally with violence of a different type, and ideological processes and all the conflicts that we have in our world today. I was asking myself question, how we Baha'is would approach these issues. If somebody came to us and say, okay, what is your solution? What we would say? What realistically we would say? That was the question that I was trying to answer in my mind. And then I said, okay, better do a little bit of research to see what the leadership of the Baha'i community at different times have suggested how we, as the members of Baha'i community, should think about these issues and should offer solutions, what kind of solutions we would offer. And the closest issue that came to my mind, of course, was the messages of the Universal House of Justice. As you know, we, in the Baha'i community, we don't have individual religious leaders. No individual has authority in the Baha'i community in terms of spiritual issues and social issues by that matter. Rather, therefore there are no clergies, no ministers, no religious leaders in that sense. But we have institutions, elected institutions, that give certain general guidance to the Baha'is according to the teachings of the Baha'i faith and teachings of Baha'u'llah. So I wanted to see whether the Universal House of Justice, that usually every year they send a message to the Baha'is of the world around on 21st of April every year. They send a message. 21st of April is a very important day in the Baha'i calendar. It is the day that Baha'u'llah declared his mission to humanity when he was in exile in Baghdad, Iraq. And it is the day in which Baha'is all around the world elect the institutions of the faith, the spiritual assemblies, local assemblies, national assemblies, and every 5 years Universal House of Justice. And therefore it is a day in which the social affairs of humanity and spiritual input of divine into humanity come together for Baha'is. So it is a very important day, and every year the Universal House of Justice sends a message to the Baha'is of the world. And I wanted to see whether in the message of the Universal House of Justice this year there was anything that referred to that, what we should do about conditions of humanity, how should we think about it. So as I looked, I came across this statement of the Universal House of Justice in their message. They said, this is 21st of April, 2012. They said, as we observe the Baha'i world at work, the evolving administrative structure, the spiritual assemblies and national assemblies and houses of justice, they are going to be houses of justice in future. The evolving administrative structure offer glimmerings, however faint, how the institutions of the faith will incrementally come to assume their future range of their responsibilities to promote human welfare and progress. So the Baha'i community establishes these institutions of the faith and helps them to evolve and mature. And we are the members of these institutions in order to promote human welfare and progress. And that's exactly what the world right now needs. The world needs welfare because the world is in very bad shape. And it needs to progress and move from the present very conflicted, very violent, very misguided ways of doing things and relating with each other to a new way. So definitely the world is in need of welfare and progress. So, as I read that, I was reminded of an interview that took place 122 years ago in the prison city of Akka. In 1890, Baha'u'llah was the prisoner of the Ottoman Empire, which later became Turkey in much smaller shape. Baha'u'llah was a prisoner. And he received Edward Granville Brown, the prominent Orientalists professor at the Cambridge University, who had been in Iran, who was fluent in Persian language, who lived in Iran many, many, many years, and who had written a lot about the Babi faith and the Baha'i faith to a certain degree. He asked permission to come to visit Baha'u'llah, and Baha'u'llah granted that permission. And it happened that he is the only Westerner that met Baha'u'llah. So that's a very, very important issue. What a Westerner would feel when he comes to the presence of Baha'u'llah, the manifestation of God. And what Baha'u'llah would say to this only Westerner that he would meet, what he would say. Well, first I read to you what Edward Brown said Edward Brown said, "The face of him on whom I gazed, I can never forget, though I cannot describe it. Those piercing eyes seem to read one's very soul. Power and authority sat on that ample brow, while the deep lines on the forehead and face implied an age which the jet black hair and beard flowing down in indistinguishable luxuriance almost to the waist seemed to bury. No need to ask in whose presence I stood, as I bowed myself before one who is the object of a devotion and love which kings might envy and emperors sigh for in vain." So he was impressed. So what Baha'u'llah said to him? Edward Brown says, "A mild, dignified voice bade me to be seated, and then continued, 'Please be to God that thou hast attained. Thou hast come to see a prisoner and an exile. We desire but the good of the world and the happiness of nations.'" This is the essence of message of Baha'u'llah to the whole world through this one person. We desire but the good of the world and the happiness of the nations. Yet they deem us as a stirrer up of strife and sedition, worthy of bondage and banishment. And then he goes on. It is a very moving account. I suggest that you all read it when you have time. It is beautiful. But I want to focus on this issue of good of the world and happiness of the nations. How do we Baha'is suggest to help humanity so that the world would be in a better place, the welfare of humanity, and people would be happy? Okay. In order to do that, we need to focus on three interrelated issues. First, for people to be in a state of happiness and for the world to be in a good situation, the fundamental needs of people need to be fulfilled. If people's basic needs are not fulfilled, people will not be happy. And the nation would not be in good shape. The welfare of humanity wouldn't be there. That's the first. So the fundamental needs of humanity needs to be fulfilled. Second, a nation and the whole world, in order for people to be happy and the societies to be happy, is that the rights of people have to be protected. In other words, issues of injustice, issues of inequality, issues of violence, of war, all of these take poverty, take away people's rights. Needs and rights are totally interconnected with each other. Needs and rights are connected. And third, people, in order to be happy, and societies in order to be orderly and in good shape, people have to show responsibility toward each other. Individuals have to show responsibility to each other in the family. Husband and wife and parents and children have to have responsibilities. Governments and nations, the population, they have responsibilities toward each other. So there are three fundamental issues that are totally interconnected. These are human needs, human rights, and human responsibilities. Okay? So, as you listen to media and read in books and magazines and journals, you see that these are the issues that people are talking about, right? Human rights, primarily they talk about human rights. They talk somewhat about human needs and a little bit about human responsibilities. Human responsibilities, usually people say, you are responsible to do this and that, rather than I am responsible to do something. But that's okay. So then question comes to us, what we understand from the study of teachings of the Baha'i faith about human needs, human rights, and human responsibilities. Okay? If somebody asked us, what are the fundamental human needs from perspective of the Baha'i faith? What we would say, So I began to reflect on that. I have been thinking about these issues for a long time because of my studies and work. And it seems to me that we human beings have fundamentally three categories of needs. Okay? Three categories of needs. The first categories, the first level categories that are the most immediate and the most urgent are survival needs. In other words, we all need food, shelter, clothing, medical help, some kind of a job, things that would help us to survive, safety, safe environments. These are called survival needs. We all have these needs all over humanity. Survival needs are the most urgent needs. And isn't that interesting that most of the discussion of the world actually focuses on survival needs? We in 21st century, we haven't been able to fulfill the survival needs of majority of the people of the world. Every day, millions of children and adults die unnecessarily because they're hungry, because they don't have food, because they have diseases that can be prevented and can be treated very easily, but they don't have access to anything because they are in the war zones, because they are in the zones of violence. Every day, every minute, this is happening. So humanity has failed to meet its survival needs. But that's the most urgent needs. But the reason that we have failed is not because we don't have enough food. It's not because we cannot create safe environments. It's not because we don't have the medical knowledge. It's not because of any of those. Because of some other reasons. And those reasons are related to the second category of needs. And the second category of needs I call them association needs. By association, I mean relationships. You see, we human beings function, relate along the dynamics of love. We want to love and we want to be loved. And therefore we establish relationships. And relationships have many different expressions. And at the core of these relationships are issues of equality, justice, freedom. Those are fundamental issues, fairness. And just look how people around the world are having enormous movements to seek justice, to seek equality, to get out of poverty, to just look at what is happening in the world. The Arab Spring is an expression of that. All the movements that have been around the world especially during the last 200 years or so, they have been all movements related to meeting, on the one hand, the basic survival needs, and on the other hand, the very pleasing association needs, okay? To establish democracy, to establish democratic societies, the rule of law. All of these are expressions of our needs to create conditions, societies, communities in which we can relate to each other in a fair, just, equal manner, free from prejudice, from oppression, from tyranny, from injustice. This is the second category of needs, and we have failed. So we have failed with respect to our first set of needs, which are survival needs, and we have failed with respect to our second set of needs, which are our ways of relationship with each other. And the third category of needs is what I call the spiritual needs. What is a spiritual need? A spiritual need refers to the process of human being connecting with the divine. And in the process of that connection with the divine, give meaning to both our survival and our associations. In other words, it's not enough to survive. We have to survive, but once we are surviving, and once we have our food and our safety and everything, there has to be a meaning in our lives. I remember one time when I was practicing psychiatry, I was called by one of my colleagues and said, "Come, I have a patient that I want you to see." He was a neurosurgeon. I said, "Tell me a little about it." He said, "Well, this is a dandy." That was all he would say. "That's a dandy." I said, "All right." When somebody a doctor call you and say, "Come see a dandy," you go to see the dandy, okay? So I went to see this person, this gentleman in around 60, sitting on the side of his bed. And he had this a Mona Lisa type of a smile on his face. You couldn't figure out why he was smiling, Was it funny? Was it, what was it? You couldn't say. So I said, "Your doctor has asked me to come and see you, but I don't know why. Tell me a little bit." He said, "You're a shrink?" I said, "Yeah, I'm a shrink." He said, "Well, I tell you. He said, as you can see, I am not a very attractive person. I'm kind of ugly." And I agreed with him. He was. He was ugly, okay? I said, "Yeah, okay, I can see, all right." He said, "I was born in a poor family. I didn't receive education. I wasn't good looking. I never asked a girl to, go out with. I never married. I learned a little bit of things to do, and I became a janitor for a building. And I lived in this building and took care of this building for about almost 45 years now. And I just have absolutely boring life. Every morning I eat 2 eggs and some toast. For lunch I have a tuna sandwich. And for dinner I usually have potato and steak. And I have lived for 45 years, for 50, 60 years like that. And finally, one day I looked at myself in the mirror. I said, "Well, this is enough, you have eaten enough eggs and tuna sandwiches and potato and, steak. And definitely, things are not going to change. It's not going to be better. And you have been a loser." So I said to myself, "Okay, I better end it." So I thought to myself, "Okay, I'm a loser. I better, if I'm going to end it, I do it the right way." Okay. So I went and bought a book, "How to Kill Yourself Successfully," or something like that. Okay, a book was about that. And he said, I went and read it, and sure enough, they suggested that the best way to do it is to put a gun in your mouth and pull the trigger. So he said, I decided to do that. But I was shy and so forth. So I went to one place and bought the cheapest gun I could. It was a very flimsy little gun. But didn't want to buy the bullet because I didn't want the guy to think that I am, So I went to another place and I bought some bullets. So I came and put it together and so forth, and I had my last supper. And I went and put it in my mouth and put the trigger, and the gun worked. And the little bullet that I had bought went through my mouth and sat between the 2 hemispheres of my brain and didn't do any injury. I came to the hospital and they said, "Oh, you have a hole in your head, but nothing else." And they took the pictures, and sure enough, the gun was there. And they said that the gun was very, very feeble gun, and the bullet was the wrong one, and it was very little, and nothing much has happened. And here I am. And he said, once a loser, always a loser. I said, "Well, yeah, I agree with you. You goofed, So we started talking and laughing, and then we started talking about the purpose of life. What is the purpose of life? And we talked over the months about a number of things, that what gives meaning and purpose to our existence, to our well-being. If we have our food, and if we live in an environment that is reasonably fair, what is the purpose of our existence? It's not enough to have your food and you have your safety and you have your, conditions of comfort and so forth. Life has to have a meaning. This is the spiritual dimension of life. Life has to have meaning. Otherwise, we are not different from animals. It is the meaning that puts human beings on a journey of eternity. You see, we can end our journey here if we live animal life, or we can go on a journey of eternity, but the journey of eternity requires purpose, meaning, and working on it. You see. Interesting enough that this gentleman, began to be volunteer in that same hospital. And did fine, he did all. But the point is that fundamental human needs are three. They are survival needs, association needs, and spiritual needs. And if we focus on today, that's what's happening. Some societies focus only on economic issues and therefore focusing on survival issues. Others focus on survival and association, issues of democracy and freedom and justice and so forth. Fundamentally, nobody is talking about the spiritual foundations of human welfare, because it is the spiritual foundations that shapes the way that we live and our survival, and it shapes the way that we use issues of justice and poverty, equality, and so forth. So the fundamental issue is that we bring together the material, the social, and the spiritual needs of humanity together. And Baha'u'llah, in his brief statement to Edward Brown, he outlined that. Let me read a little bit more about what Baha'u'llah said to Edward Brown, because that's very interesting how elaborated about this. He said, "We desire but the good of the world and the happiness of the nations. That all nations should become one in faith." You see, spiritual dimension. "And all men as brothers. That the bonds of affection and unity between the sons of men should be strengthened." He's talking about association. The human relationships in the context of the teachings of the Baha'i faith revolve around the concept of unity. We have become united, which is again dependent on our awareness of the fundamental oneness of humanity. Then Baha'u'llah says, unity between the sons of men should be strengthened, that diversity of religion should cease, and differences of race be annulled. What harm is there in this? Yet, so it shall be, these fruitless strifes, these ruinous wars shall pass away. Now Baha'u'llah is describing what he sees as the future of humanity, what he wants to create for humanity. Okay? The most great peace shall come. Do not you in Europe need this also? Is not this that which Christ foretold? Yet do we see your kings and rulers lavishing their treasures more freely on means for the destruction of the human race than on that which would conduce to the happiness of mankind. Baha'u'llah, at that time, around that time, has written the most holy book, his most holy book. In it, he has foretold the two world wars. He knew that World War I and II would come. And he is referring to it, that your leaders are accumulating instruments of war to do that. These strifes and this bloodshed and discord must cease, and all men be as one kindred and one family. Let not a man glory in this, that he loves his country. Let him rather glory in this, that he loves his kind. Now, isn't that interesting? A prisoner 122 years ago in Akka, far off land, gives this mission to humanity, foresees what's going to happen to humanity, outlines the fundamental needs of humanity for survival, for association, and for spiritualization. And he calls upon people to do it. And he establishes a Baha'i community, which now Universal House of Justice says they see glimmerings, faint glimmerings of the emergence of Baha'i community to be able to dedicate itself to the welfare of humanity. But in order to do that, we Baha'is have to have a consciousness of that. Because if we are not conscious of our objective, we wouldn't achieve anything. Anything that in life we want to achieve, the first thing that we have to have is the consciousness and vision of what is it that we want to achieve. If we don't know it, if we don't think about it, if we don't focus on it, we wouldn't achieve it. How many times we sit and think, how am I going to help for the happiness of nations, the welfare of humanity, the good of humanity? Do we do that? Do we think about these issues? It should be forefront of our mind. Because then we constantly ask ourselves, am I doing what is conducive to good of the world and happiness of nations, as Baha'u'llah says is his objective? Or put it in a different word, the Universal House of Justice says our responsibility is to promote human welfare and progress. Do we as individuals, as communities, as institutions, in our deliberations, in our discussions, reflect on this? If we don't, then these things go in the background. But these have to become in the foreground, because the world of humanity is in a very, very difficult situation. And I was thinking, when Baha'u'llah in another place says, address yourselves to the promotion of the well-being and tranquility of the children of men. You see? Bend your minds and wills to what? Bend your minds and your wills to the education of the peoples and kindreds of the earth. Okay, why? For what purpose? That happily, the dissension that divided may be blotted out from the face of earth. See, everything that Baha'u'llah tells us to do focuses on ultimately on the issue of creating unity and creating peace. Education should be focused on that. Progress of humanity would be only possible when the strifes would go away. Look at the world of humanity. The world of humanity today is the world of conflict and strife. Our responsibility as Baha'is is to focus on how can we dedicate ourselves to the welfare of humanity. How can we do it? And in this respect, there are two ways that Baha'is function. One, we as Baha'is are very eager to invite our friends who are studying the Baha'i faith to join us and become Baha'is. And join the Baha'i community and join in the activities, in the conscious effort to establish this kind of community that would promote the welfare of humanity. In the Baha'i faith, we call it teaching the Baha'i faith. Okay? So, for those of us who have brought our friends here to be a little bit informed about the Baha'i faith, that's a teaching activity that we do. That's fine. But that's one area of activity. There is a direct approach, so to speak. But there is an indirect approach. And the indirect approach happens through our activities that promotes the teachings of the Baha'i faith. We constantly should be involved in promoting the teachings of the faith without needing to invite people to become Baha'is. Okay? How you promote your teachings of the Baha'i faith? You promote unity, you promote peace, you promote peace-based education, you promote peace-based relationships, you promote unity in context of diversity, harmony of races, equality of men and women. All of these activities are promotion of those teachings that are essential for the welfare of humanity. But they all take place with that realization that human beings have those three fundamental needs: survival needs, association needs, and spiritual needs. That human beings also have three fundamental rights. Every human being has the right that his or her survival needs are met, has the right to justice, freedom, equality, freedom from oppression, from prejudice, and has the right to express his or her spiritual conviction. Like Baha'is in Iran, they cannot do it. They are put in prison and they are killed because they are Baha'is, and the Iranian government says, you do not have the right to have the spiritual orientation that you have. You see? So human needs and human rights are the same. Our human needs are survival needs, association needs, and spiritual needs. Our rights are the same. And along with all human needs and human rights come human responsibilities. What does it mean? It means that with respect to human responsibility means that I should not only look after my own welfare, but I should look after the welfare of other people. I should see myself responsible for the poor in my community, for the oppressed in my community, for the oppressed in the world. I should feel responsible for those who are subject to prejudice, to inequality, to injustice. I should feel responsible for those who are not allowed to express and practice their spiritual rights and spiritual convictions. I should feel responsible for those. Should work. We have to be active in the arena of life. We shouldn't be passive. We should be active. We should be in the forefront. We should bring about conditions in which awareness of this nature comes to the forefront of people's lives. So these become totally interconnected. Human needs, human rights, and human responsibilities are totally interconnected, and they are focused ultimately for a spiritualization of the world, which would then allow the needs and the rights to be met in a peaceful and unified and diverse context. So these were some of thoughts that I had as I watched television and reflected on what is happening in our world. And I asked myself the question, how do we as Baha'is address some of these issues? All right, dear friends, thank you very much. Thank you. Yes, thank you.